Oh, did I hit record or did someone else hit record? Oh,
I
we're
got it.
recording. Oh, you got it? Oh, thanks, Liam. Okay, great. So let's see. So we are really lucky to have Aruna here today giving a guest talk. And I have been reading more of Aruna's work, which is an amazing foray into climate reporting. And Aruna is an independent journalist and writer originally from India, currently located at the University of Oxford, and her interests and work dwell on themes of corporate accountability, climate change, indigenous rights and resistance, environmental law, energy, conflict, gender, and public health. And her stories have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, New Internationalist, BuzzFeed, and many other outlets. And Aruna excels at telling difficult stories and finding different ways to bring to light aspects of the climate crisis and the human impacts of this crisis. So she has a lot of thoughts to share about climate communications, writing and storytelling around climate change, ways to center the human aspects of this challenge while highlighting and being motivated by the science. And I've really enjoyed my conversations with her leading up to this talk. And thank you so much for being here today, Aruna. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lainey, and also to Kamal for choosing to invite me to this. Terra sounds like an amazing venture to bring a lot of new practitioners, enthusiasts, professionals from across the world, and I think especially two demographics that I'm really interested in, and from the US and from India, where the changes that are necessary are vital and to be pushed forward through this decade. So what we do in both the US as well as India will really count towards where we go as a planet, and crucial to life itself. So really lovely to be here. To folks from India, thank you for joining at this really late hour. 11 baj gaya hai. I mean, and must be, I hope no one is watching Republic TV or late night news at this hour. And so from the news that doesn't get programmed typically, so I do have a presentation, and at some point please feel free if the images are just a bit much, and if we'd rather shift to doing a voice on voice conversation. And I hope to save more time. So Lainey, just feel free to interrupt me or to moderate,
Yeah.
so that we have enough time for questions, of which I'm actually interested in that more than anything. So welcome everyone. I'm going to try and do the share screen thing and not be a boomer in that sense of trying to navigate technology and failing terribly. So just to see if, can you see my screen? That,
Yes.
okay, all right. So I'm just going to start with, yeah. All right. So the premise of this talk is whether it's climate action or climate communication. I think it's vital that we keep people and not necessarily only carbon emissions at the heart of our messaging. So a bit about myself and how I got here, which was the UN climate talks in this was COP23 in Bonn, and I think like this image sort of conveys my feeling at the end of being in a fortnight of diplomatic and Machiavellian maneuvering to produce text that doesn't necessarily say very much or speak to the realities that we know. And here you have an indigenous leader, Black feminist, and again speaking to a youth activist. And I think sort of from, at least from my own journey, that this is something that I've seen, and going through climate law and everything else that emerges, this is our front line of resistance, right? Of looking at how communities on the front lines and who've faced historical injustices can collaborate and are pushing states as well as corporations to do better because it's our lives at stake, and always to remember that some people are more disproportionately affected. This was actually at the Fiji COP where everyone kept saying, beautiful buzzwords like "we are all in the same canoe," and I'm like, no, some of us are in an oil tanker, some of us are in a tiny boat, some of us are in a Elon Musk powered submarine somewhere, but all states are at completely different levels, and we're not in the same boat, not the super rich and otherwise. So it's sort of important to keep that focus. So this is me at the start of this journey, much younger, not quite Greta age like, but this is me at 24. I had studied, I was in Bombay, and went to study journalism. I thought I'd become an ad film director. Look at me now. So I was working in network television production department, which meant dealing with 40 camera people and also getting to see how editorial priorities are decided as well as they shift. Now, at that point of time was when I started looking at stories coming out from especially around land conflicts, forest conflicts, and something called an Operation Green Hunt is what the Congress government, or at that point it started. I was like, okay, that is a strange word to describe, and it was described as a crackdown on India's greatest internal security threat, which is against left-wing extremist groups. But essentially, protesters or local communities who essentially were fighting for their lands, for their ecosystems, for their traditional livelihoods, were opposing projects democratically. And this was tainted at the same time. So I decided that upon advice from others as well, that, hey, you can speak a bunch of different languages. What are you doing in a city like Bombay? So go to closer to where you see is happening. And what kind of stood out for me was that a lot of the images and things that emerged from these places, I was like, okay, this is closer to home. Why have I never read about indigenous communities and their histories? Why are they not in my textbooks? Why are their stories, their assertions not part of our freedom struggle or in the ways that we tell these stories about resistance movements? And I think for me, that still continues to be something that is jarring whenever we describe climate activists. It always is activists who have sort of and essentially is around the school strikes, as if there were no environmental movements before that, as if so yeah, I think it's really important that we center this and say that, okay, that there have been communities who've been resisting for a really long time, and it's important that we give them their due. So I, as an upper caste woman of medium privilege, and someone who's educated, decided, or at that time I was trying to come to terms with my own extraction footprint of where does my land come from, or where does my water or my energy, and what are these places, what are the costs of this development? And would always be the narrative for so long in India has been this whole environment versus development, very basic debate, and even the economic reasons for it would so often be described in such basic terms. Now, going and seeing this, so on the right hand side is again, it was so there was a power plant, a coal plant, which was being built on a very rare and endangered wetland. And my older brother had been documenting migratory bird species and why this was an important bird area and why it didn't necessarily need a coal plant. And so I went there after there was a police firing, and police had lobbed tear gas shells on roofs. So you see the burnt house, and met families of the dead, of people who were killed in a police firing there. And once you see something like that, it becomes very hard to turn away. But at the same time, I think the main thing that I took away, or at least understood from that, was development is very, very different from how we envision and see it in terms of a very bloodless or sometimes a bloody quest towards economic growth, and where the people towards which this development is targeted seldom receive any of the benefits. But it also taught me, I mean, one of the most important lessons as a climate journalist or an activist or anybody else doing or engaged in this sort of work is to go and see for yourself. Uh, Really to go and investigate what are these projects like, who are the people who live there, to talk to them, and understand what are their situated knowledges. Now, I mean, this whole talk of environmentalism development is also rooted in a high modernist sort of language, which James C. Scott talks of in his book, seminal book, Seeing Like a State, where it's essentially a muscle bound version of the state, and where you say that scientific and technical progress is all that matters. Now, Prime Minister Nehru back in the day referred to dams as the modern temples of India. Now we have situations such as the Kerala floods, where extreme rainfall events, but like 33 dams were open at the same time, and a lot of the hydrologists who were taking these decisions had kept some of the water, 25% of the dams full, because of water insecurity. So you have these various different factors at play. Like on one hand, you're safeguarding against drought or not being able to have electricity. On the other hand, these high modernist things that are supposed to be flood defenses are just completely opened without. And we had like Supreme Court lawyers and or states fighting a petition on the opening of the dam as the water level was rising. So with every centimeter, you're still seeing this being fought over on Twitter and in court, which is extremely surreal. But at the same time, of course, yes, development comes with its benefits. There is a right to development and a right to carbon space. That way, India and the US might be at completely different ends of the spectrum. And of course, it has created this one world sense where but now, as much as that model of development has, and the Friedman-esque economics has filtered or down or been pushed into different areas, it has also, and of course, brought benefits. It has brought has been able to break certain things, like for India, like looking at caste politics or looking at mobility. There have been benefits to that growth, but at the same time, like the potential ecological uh, the risk is also has been exported. So now we're all in that boat, and that's that sort of soup. But as I threaded through this whole thing of high modernism or trying to understand how development takes place, or where was my power coming from, and what are these like quite literal imbalances of power. So yeah, I spent my 20s staring into the abyss. So don't give me a t-shirt that says climate justice now. It comes from the idea. I mean, I worked as a researcher with Amnesty International, like looking at looking at its coal mines, looking at India's coal mines and indigenous rights violations. Now, what you see there is one of India's biggest mines, and for public-owned coal mines, you do not have to seek the consent of local communities. You can pass um, 3 notifications in a gazette. I don't know who the hell reads a gazette, and in a government gazette, and you can say that this is now the property of the Ministry of Coal. We have seen that it contains uh, there are mineral reserves, and now we can transfer the rights to the company. So without having to whisper a word to local communities. Of course, there are environmental laws that deem for public consultation, but this just means that they have to be heard, not necessarily listened to. And in the last 4 years, we've seen the rollback of these laws, where essentially people do not have a say in their own development, or in their displacement, or in terms of these impacts for these extremely wide mines. Now, this mine, for instance, can fit the whole of the can fit the whole of central Delhi within it. Now, those are the sizes of, and this is just one. So we've got 3 more right next to it. And of course, we're continuing to rapidly expand that for no known reason. Technically, we have all of the power that we need. Many of these villages around didn't have power or didn't have reliable access to it. So who is this going to? What are these economies of scale? So that led me to further these things. So essentially, when we talk about metrics and measurement, and when we would say that, okay, this is as much, we would say this is a 9 million ton per annum coal mine that will generate this much power and this much, so on and so forth. And we talk about metrics and measurement in looking at, so if we were to say that, okay, there's historical responsibility, and of course we have the right to pollute, so on and so forth, and we have these inventories that measure greenhouse gases. If we were to look at on ground, how does measurement, or how does this go by? I found extreme contrast in how records are kept. So for instance, those are the papers that an indigenous uh, landholder would have to show, which are based on pre-independence land surveys conducted by the British, but pieces of paper to essentially show that this land is theirs. And I would go into these massive offices or panchayat or local district offices and see bundles and bundles of files gathering dust, which are forest rights claims. So on one hand, the government can say that forest cover is increasing, and that's based on flawed methodology. And the UNFCCC and can say that, okay, there might be an error here, not all is what it seems, but it can't make a further political comment. On the other hand, on ground, we're seeing the greatest diversion of forest land that has only been stepped up by the weakening of laws. But at the same time, we don't necessarily, these are the sorts of records that are kept. Now, for that state, which has these huge mines, there's not even a single real time public air quality monitor that is making available this data. Now we keep zooming in on Delhi, and like every winter there's a new Reuters infographic that, or there will be something else that shows how many. Now the city of Delhi has around 37 to 38 different pollution monitors. This entire state that has some of the biggest coal mines, power plants, industries, steel, and manufacturing areas, which also has an extremely high indigenous population, doesn't have a single one. So if we're like, so I think one of the major considerations while we keep talking about metrics and monitoring is, where is the data? Now, a lot of weather data is also not made publicly available. So in that sense, data can be weaponized, it can be disguised, and essentially that in terms of metrics matters more and more. So now, for instance, Arnold Schwarzenegger said something like "Hasta la vista, fossil fuels," but at COP23, but was also from a school of thought where he said that air pollution can be the one way that we can talk about the climate crisis in a way that talks about lived experience and that connects to people. But we don't conduct health impact assessments now. For the first time, like, communities are having to do this themselves, video conference with judges, get judgments for the first time that say that there should be a carrying capacity study of how much how much wood can a woodchuck chuck, or how much coal can an industrial town take, how much new industry or development. That those are not necessarily metrics or assessments that are being made or prioritized. So those are the sorts of questions that we need to ask and need to question, when even though we might be making all of this emissions data transparent, we're talking about 68% cuts, we're talking about emissions reductions of this particular kind, we're not calculating these costs. We're also not calculating the costs of loss and damage. These are purely indicative. And we have, I mean, all the impacts on Black and brown indigenous communities. What are their lungs versus a person in Delhi's lungs? And what are these different thresholds that we have, as much as we might say that right to carbon space and otherwise. So yeah, I mean, one of the things that stuck out from a particular paper is the idea of measurementality, where it comes from this sense of, you break the environment down into discrete units, and essentially we become more about the measurement. So you will have, yes, we have this transparency report, that ESG report, other data that's here. So it's essentially a flood of information to tell us things are all right sometimes, and give us the impression that a country's climate pledge is enough or not enough, based on information they submit themselves and can manipulate. So the idea where we've become so much more about metrics and measurement. For instance, now what gets counted and doesn't get counted. Now, according to national inventories of greenhouse gases, those are national. Now, like a country like Australia, for instance, is one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels. But because those emissions are not on its own territory, those are emissions that it doesn't have to take responsibility for. Uh, so I'm and same goes for the US. Now, if ExxonMobil wants to export more gas to the rest of the world, that is not on the US. It's on everybody else. So this counts where, of course, well, technically, in a way, you could say that, well, it's their responsibility if they're buying. But what if it doesn't get counted at all? And if this is exported to countries where it doesn't make a dent on their climate targets, where do those emissions go? So now, for instance, also, like Australia doesn't count wildfire emissions beyond a point, because they say that this is part of a natural disturbances clause. Now you have more science which tells you that these fires have been exacerbated more than 30% because of climate change. Are we going to review what natural causes are, natural disturbances, and who's going to take account for what happened there? Because wildfires counted in Australia, which were devastating, counted for up to 1 to 2% of CO2 emissions last year. Now, are we going to count that? So below, we look at an installation which me and a friend and others were involved in, which were to set up air quality monitors in these industrial towns and using low cost monitors to be able to challenge the government version or a corporate version, to be able to take it to court and otherwise. But then again, this responsibility seems to further and further be falling on one of my gurus is essentially says that we should call them extra governmental organizations, not non-governmental organizations, because we continue to fulfill a function that states aren't doing. So I think the important thing is also to look at what are these blind spots, where are the gaps in the data, and how do we fill that. So I don't know why this screen is not shifting. I think we seem to be stuck. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay. Again, this is why trust the science is one part of an interesting exercise, but I don't seem to be trusting the science very much at this moment. Anyway, so I'm going to try and see if I can close that. But essentially, to take off from there, which is the idea of looking at who is responsible for looking at how stories are told or how we communicate things. Now, I think right now is a time where we're towards the end of the year. Paris Agreement turns 5. China likes to refer to it as baby, or the Paris Agreement is the world's baby. And now that baby is now going to walk on its own 2 feet without having much teeth. So as much as we talk about transparency in the agreement, and also about the fact that, hey, everyone's sharing data and it's comparable, we're all on the same page, at least in terms of being able to submit things and make them transparent. The word accountability doesn't appear in the Paris Agreement even once. And of course, the politics of negotiations, all of that we can go back to and be like, well, come on, but Barack was also responsible for not ensuring that there was accountability in the agreement, that the US severely fought back against that. But the fact that accountability doesn't exist, and that you draft your own pledges. It can be a 3-page document, which is Australia's NDC. It can be a 38-page document that cites Mahatma Gandhi 4 times and says cool things like the earth has its needs and greed and so on and so forth, and not necessarily be accountable for it. So the only time that there is, of course, the global stock take, but it takes stock of everybody's climate pledges. and not individually. So, and this is the decade where this will count the most, which is essentially looking at emissions reductions by to nearly halve in this decade. And so, which leaves us with the question of where is it and who is responsible for ensuring that these targets are met? Who is facing the impacts? How do we humanize as well as highlight this in our communications? And how do we tell stories where people care? Now, um, I think one of the things that I've realized as a communicator, as a journalist, is the fact that as much as I've been trying to talk about, you know, climate change or doing these early pieces of research, the things that seem to resonate most with people, or the things that I've been alienated more and more by, is the idea that common sense is not something that's incredibly valued. And as much as we say things, we might quote Donna Haraway and talk about situated knowledges, the idea that sometimes that, hey, displacing people, pushing them off their lands, setting up a carbon capture or a plantation to soak up emissions is not necessarily a great idea, especially if it doesn't have the consent of the community that's living there. Or to say that, well, right, the world is on fire, like the GIF, and everything is not fine. But where do we go from here? So I think if one of the most alienating factors, and my brother keeps telling me you chose the most boring beat to work on, I hate to admit it, but it is, and it's full of acronyms like carbon capture and storage, yes, essential, necessary at some stage, but a lot of these technologies are untested. We talk about EIAs and SIAs and all kinds of other assessments that exist, but looking at how they're carried on ground with police cover, with people in places where people are not formally literate, and then you talk about giving them a 100-page English EIA document or one that's in Hindi a day before, and asking and not and at gunpoint asking them what they think about it. So I don't know what element of the free and fair, but it's also led us to a situation where, as climate nerds or as communicators, we often resort to talking in the same acronyms, or we reduce complex ecosystems, we reduce uh, people and nature and that diverse, interconnected relationship to binaries, to abbreviations, and to from a point where our connection with the environment has become something that's both outsourced, not experienced or felt, or it seems to be missing from the conversation, where people are now more are pushed to think of climate change, uh, or pushed to think about ecological devastation from a very, well, do they have it under control? Yes, they're saying they're going to do this percentage of reductions over a by 2050, a year by which my one of my many home cities of Bombay will be underwater, and unlivable. So essentially that this becomes something where, of course, that you have companies who will say we've done our due diligence, here are our reports. So it becomes more of, okay, if you've done your monitoring, reporting, evaluation, that you can again, you can say you have independent experts, but again, from my own investigations and studies and stories, that these are rarely what happens, or the situation on ground. So I think one of the things that I've learned, at least through trying to communicate this using film, using photo exhibits, and otherwise, I'm still trying to figure out how to stop my screen from hanging. But life literally hanging in the balance. But one of the things that I've sort of that I've at least been trying to experiment with is the importance of telling stories and the importance of foregrounding communities who are at the heart of it. Because I mean, sometimes what does happen is that a lot, and as hard as we want to hold on to hope, our jobs as journalists as well as climate communicators or as activists is to challenge the official narrative, the narrative, or to challenge this alphabet of reducing complex ecosystems, relationships between communities and who depend on nature for their livelihoods, for or don't depend on nature for their livelihoods. It's just a source of a reason to live. If you don't have a tree outside your house in the middle of a pandemic and you can't go for a walk, yes, it is going to impact your mental health. Maybe there's Wordsworth and Keats who and uh, thousands of other poets and writers who've at one point used to, I mean, this was seen as a romantic era in literature where when nature played a more important role, to now it being a very self-reflective, let's look at our existential crisis and not necessarily look outside the window. So I think one of the things that I've been trying to highlight through this is also the idea that today you look at Modi as a climate leader, or to say that Boris Johnson is a climate leader, or to say that looking at far right governments and looking to them for hope. And every single statement or everything that's issued is something that we welcome with hope, and we welcome every single baby step with this. But we need to break down the acronyms, and we need to look at where those impacts are. So at the end of my entire sojourn with on trying to understand fossil fuel finance, to impacts, to everything, I think one of the main fundamental issues remains, which is of inequality. And the fact that I'm a Brahmin woman who is dependent on electricity that comes from the violent displacement of communities, that the fact that most of us actually do rely on furnaces continuing to burn in China for our latest, for the new Apple headphones that will make zero differences to our lives. And so, I mean, to be able to acknowledge that fundamental inequality, that the impacts, as one of the things that turns me off when there are a lot of like conversations around climate grief, it is a thing, but the grief of somebody having to cycle in coal districts to their workplace or to the factories while their land is taken away from them is another level of climate grief. Or that, if I mean, not to of course put grief on any kind of a sliding scale, but to recognize that there is fundamental inequality, class inequality, regional, geographic, who gets a greater right to pollute, who gets to live certain lifestyles. Where do we draw a line? Who is impacted? Is there regional inequity that needs to be addressed? And if all plans are essentially carried out at a national level, who are the communities who are fighting back and resisting, and who are at the front lines of climate action, who are getting arrested? And again, XR was not the first, and they will not be the last. And we've had environmental resistance movements who've been jailed, tagged as terrorists over the ages, and also in recent years that seems to be on the rise. As much as I'm here talking to you about climate journalism, most of the best environmental journalists and climate journalists back in India are freelancers now, because their papers and their publications have decided to or refuse to name names, or didn't consider it a beat that's important enough. So most of the coverage that we look at, it's to be a climate journalist is largely to be white, and largely or to be from somewhere in the global north. And until recently, strange that most climate journalists or people who call themselves that are from a Trump-led state, which is as or essentially from US climate policy perspective. Of course, you can write in and parachute into different situations. But yeah, to me, I find that to be and it's also something that you are seeing in the US. Like a lot of local bureaus are going, are losing staff, people are getting laid off. And that is essentially where a lot of the important journalism comes from. if you don't have a bureau that's in a coal town, and if you aren't having these stories being told, no wonder people are disgruntled. No wonder people from the heartland or from these parts of the country feel that their concerns are not being addressed, or that they don't have a voice or a foot in the media. So I think if at the center of our climate action is essentially going to be local, I think the value that is placed on reporting locally to be able to support those who do it. And I think that becomes sometimes more valuable, and is infinitely more valuable than another podcast. And or someone like me coming and delivering a talk, or being able to do some of that. So how do you keep newsrooms alive? How do you tell stories in a humane way that is not necessarily only for the experts? How do you hold states to account in spite of wanting to hold on to hope as um, closely as you can, because it is a depressing beat. And yeah, how do you connect the local to the regional, to the national, to the global? And that's what I've attempted to do through many of my stories. But I think um, the complexity is what makes the beat interesting, or and it's the diversity in nature, or in people, or in causes and solutions, or to the completely different raggedy taggedy bunch of characters that constitute the resistance, or again phenomenal, flawed politics, problematic, but and that's what makes it compelling, and essential for us to tell these stories. Um, so yeah, well, on that note, Lainey, would you should we
Yeah.
open for questions?
Yeah, I will open that up. I'm gonna bring us all back into our main room here. Um, and yeah, let's see. So and if anyone has a question, feel free to type it into the chat or just put your name and I can call on you. Um, and yeah, and if you're able to speak it out loud, we'll do that. And if you are not and would like me to ask it, I'm happy to do so. So um, yeah, I'll just let those trickle in for a moment. And thank you so much for those words, Aruna. It was really a great way to see some of the images and connect it to the themes of what you're describing and talking about. And I think it really resonates with a lot of the course themes that we're exploring, and makes a lot of sense. So it was a great framing of our sort of collective action problem we're tackling here at Terra.
I'm so glad. Apologies for the screen freezing. I think maybe I can try and see if I can get PowerPoint to behave. We can.
Yeah,
Yeah,
if
but
we want
PowerPoints
to
are
bring that
the
up, we
enemy.
can. Yeah.
That's essentially what a lot of corporate lobbyists use to get things passed quickly. But I never said that. Please don't hang on me, Microsoft.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, and maybe while a few questions come in from any of our fellows, I'll just jump in with one that I was thinking about, partially because I'm editing some of our class slides on the emissions gap report and countries that have pledged to reach some sort of net zero carbon target in the next 20 years or so. And I'm just curious, like how in your reporting you like think about or talk about or try and balance the fact that the emissions gap might be widening from like actual emissions tracking versus pledges that are increasing in ambition or something like this. Like it seems like you could, if you focus on one or the other, you could end up with an incredibly uplifting or an incredibly depressing, and really like what is, how are people reporting that, or how are you thinking about that, those two different trends?
I mean, I think one thing is to sort of get comfortable with the idea that you're a Debbie Downer, um, in the sense that you will be seen as a bit of a doomsday prophet. It sucks, but that's the job. And to be able to, as much as, and it's literally the job to speak truth to power now, and to be able to look into what are these long-term targets, um, who's going to be around when these targets are enforced, when is the next election, is this current state going to be the one to implement it? And if we're looking at that far into the future, um, and how are they showing their commitment to it in terms of decisions that are immediately related to such pledges and targets? So you can say that Norway might be opening up more Arctic exploration for oil, or um, you might be like, okay, coal auctions for 41 new coal mines underway, but here is the promise from Gandhi. But at the same time, there is, of course, questions of, yes, historical responsibility and other questions of poverty. I think the stories are complex and we shouldn't shy away from them. The idea to simplify is exists, but I think the if simplification while losing out on truth and while losing out on a ground perspective is to me does more damage than good, and it often comes in from a perspective of doing this from afar, which unfortunately this year has been very strange and very limiting, because yeah, this is the first time that I've not had as many aviation emissions or from traveling to different places, or taking the bus or the train to go and see and look at the fallout of these projects. But I do think that it's important to not decide on the tone of a story, um, to investigate first, compare what they're saying, how likely is it to happen, people who are directly impacted, whether they're communities that are transitioning from fossil fuels, to those who are facing climate impacts, get those voices on board, and ask those questions. Yeah. So
Yeah.
okay, there are 6 more questions, so I'm going to like, Peter's cat has just typed in a very interesting question. I agree. That's what emissions net zero targets sound like to me too.
Yeah. And I think Ashish was raising his hand, so I'm gonna call on Ashish to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Aruna. I think there is largely consensus that your talk was um, as expected. So we expected as much. Thank you very much for the time you spent. And it's been a long time that I've heard the word Bombay, and you said that thrice. So we're now not used to saying that. So thanks for that. I love that. I still like being the city being called Bombay, by the way. um, but a quick question. A lot of what you said was about what is not right, and we would need some inspiration from you for this cohort. We called orcas, right, behind the endangered species. So we would like you to leave us with some message on what are things that you observe in your day-to-day conversations with people that are going right, and that we should continue to do. Is that something that you can spend a couple of minutes talking about, and leaving us with a inspiring thought on what is actually going right?
Okay. This is a good bit of good cue for me, because this, as much as I might call myself a doomsday prophet, it takes the spirit of an eternal optimist. I'm also a stand-up comic, so yeah, I have to find one is trying to find gallows humor to keep you going, but the other is that hope is all around us. I wrote a piece in BuzzFeed, which I will share with the group, of looking for hope in the climate negotiations, but for me, one is, of course, the moment that we are in. I don't. The last time we've seen this kind of what we might describe as momentum, or at least states pledging or starting to say that climate is a concern, that they have targets, that they're going to set this, is a sign that the pressure is working. Um, us in the global south, we don't need to be told that climate change is real, or we don't have this kind of denier, because that's something that's lived and felt. Extreme weather events, again, beautiful Bombay and its spirit keeps getting invoked, and now people, ministers say things like now blaming things on climate change, when I'm like, no, the governance has a lot to do with it. If we can't build stormwater drains, then how are we going to? But Bombay, if I were to just take that as a city, um, there were two movements which were incredibly inspiring. One is the RA movement to save the city's lungs. Now to see corporate consultants joining hands with indigenous elders, to see working class people put pressure. Yes, the trees were hacked. Yes, the forest did fall. But one of the reasons I left Bombay was because I felt that people were too disengaged. It's a city where, again, it's united by the traffic, the hustle, everyone's got one chance to make it, and by the trains. But people tend to forget that there is that other connecting factor, which is the air, water, and environment. So that's something that really hit home with the RA movement, and seeing this kind of groups that would ordinarily not be built, to see this sort of mobilization happening, and also for them to connect with the wider climate strikes, was something really interesting to see happen. And so I draw hope from that, where urban, rural, global movements are connecting, putting pressures on leaders, and actually caring about putting enough pressure on power so that it makes that a priority. Now, suddenly, after all of these years, like again, like Mahul, now there's another industrial toxic hellhole, where people who are living next to Bombay's water pipelines were displaced, and they were considered a security threat to the city's water and for its richest residents in Kolaba or in South Bombay. And they were pushed into these towers, which are where no sunlight could penetrate, and that was surrounded by oil refineries, factories. These people organized, and a woman who could barely walk managed to climb these project blocks, organize people. They made 8-kilometer long human chains, scared the administration enough to secure their rehabilitation. They were fighting for the city's right to breathe, saying that air quality is important, that this is and to see this happening in urban areas is something that's new, and I get hope from that. Of course, yes, the fact that states are being shamed to do, even if these targets are flaky, at least the public pressure and awareness has grown enough that where I would ordinarily hear people only talk about plastic as an environmental impact, that now climate and its connection to fossil fuels, I feel less alone now. And of course, the fact that there are so many, whether it's the nerds who hang out outside the negotiations where the US and China and India are fighting it out, staying awake at 4 in the morning just to make sure that they see civil society actors and know that the world is watching. That gives me hope that there are people still in this fight, who will video conference with a judge, take 4 buses to get to a place where you have an internet link and fight for the right to breathe. That, and this coming from someone, an indigenous elder who can barely who can barely write in English. And seeing communities take this while they have criminal charges against them, while their funding is being cut off, while they're dealing with repression, taking those risks. So yeah, that gives me hope every day, that you get up in the morning and you have a reason both to fight, but also, I mean, I think what we also need to take away from is start giving people reasons to want to protect what is around them. And I think maybe COVID-19 has also made us realize that we do treasure our green spaces a lot more, and you're being made aware of the fact that they're vanishing, or that there's a reason to fight for it. So yeah, those are my. And for this cohort, I mean, we live at a time where this can be communicated. We can say these things, push for power, and have a message go out, versus a time where it was concentrated in the hands of like either a few editors, a few journalists, and otherwise. So I think there is a space to share, to really, and yeah, sorry, I mean, this one is going, since you asked for my reasons to hope. A thing that I'm a really dear friend of mine, Nathan Thanki, who was with Demand Climate Justice, said to me was, and I was at my absolute low because I'd come from the central India's massive coal fields to the UN climate talks, and I was like, where the hell am I? What is the point of this? Why are they fighting over a semicolon and a comma? And but he said and I mean, I was running out of reasons to live at that point, and he said something to me that had a huge impact, saying that if the only thing we can imagine is the end of the world, then we have very stunted imaginations. So if there is a time for us to be thinking, and I think this is where, either the Green New Deal or others, formulations which seem to be coming through, I think it's missing on the Indian left, because we haven't, either we're in constant firefighting mode, or 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 politicians are using this sort of divisiveness on the basis of race or religion, or trying to really push reactionary politics, that we are so busy doing the firefighting that we are not doing the imagining. And this could actually be that extremely creative time where we can take time out to see what is the future, articulate what do we want it to be like, and actually fight for it, put forward candidates who are, and young people are like, hey, I can never afford an apartment, so might as well join, the struggle or resistance, or whether it's sharing it on Instagram alone. But it is, another world is possible, and we need to be the ones articulating what that can be, and make it creative, compelling, compassionate, and community oriented. And yeah, that need for community is now more important than ever before. So yeah, when we first all sorted in our individual bubbles, it's important to have that. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's another super resonant theme for the space at Terra that we're working on, which starts with having everyone write a future in 2040 assignment where we envision the world that we want to be living in 20 years. And I think that is a really like perfect example of what you're talking about, having the creativity and the, bravery to imagine not the end of the world, but the beginning of a much better time for humanity. And I actually am really excited to try and get some of the amazing responses that people write for that assignment sort of recorded and made into a short video or something, because I think it's a great example of what you're talking about, and a really great way to start the course.
I know we have 3 minutes left, but if you don't mind me going over, or if you have a time limit on it, some of the questions here seem really interesting.
They
Bardamala
do.
had put in a
Yeah,
question
let's go
saying,
to that. Yeah. I'm happy to keep it open for a little bit, and if people drop off, I'll share the
yeah,
recording.
please feel free to drop off, and like any point, like just drop me a tweet or if something else, and then we can get in touch. But how do you interact with communities or potential climate refugees? But um, I think one of the things here is to also not come from a paternalistic space, or the thing of, sometimes we know better. There are things you do know better, and they don't necessarily understand the import of climate change. Yes, there are pressing socioeconomic problems, and I think it's always going to be, climate is something. If you're living already with some terrible inequality, where your land is being taken from you, where you're pushed into caste professions that undermine your dignity, you're working these many hours a day, are you going to be sitting and thinking about climate? You know that something is definitely going to worsen, but are you going to be able to ask a like coastal community to campaign against a coal mine somewhere else? And who is it that you're looking at, in terms of, yeah. So during the Kerala floods as well, I mean, there was a lot of push, them to say, and at that point there was so much anger, to say that, okay, why are we in these landslide zones? Can we implement better recommendations? My As a journalist, I mean, I'm aware of the fact that I'm coming in with a Nikon telephoto lens and other things, and always going to get there in a car, or have people and like come in with immense privilege. But what I think is important is to take whatever information you have with you. It's always to me, it's always an exchange. I'm not, and to be aware that we are being extractive. You know, as journalists, I think sometimes we have these huge chip on our shoulders that we're doing like a huge service to humanity. We're not. We're also, it is a dishonest profession where we extract stories and the pain of people and put it together as words, and maybe never, revisit the story or the place or the people. And that's an approach that I'm very wary of. So I think it's important to take documents, the same things where you're like, okay, have you consented to this project, which apparently has your signature on it? Here are the documents that I've availed as part of it. The same things that I would be using for the stories to be able to share it with the communities, to talk about it in the same way that one is having these interviews and taking. I think for me, both as an activist, activist journalism is often seen as slander, but to me, I think it's perfectly fine if you have the access to be able to go to places and go to communities who are facing this and stick a microphone in their faces and asking them, how are you feeling, aapko kaise lag raha hai? You have the duty to also be able to take some of the documents, take some of the things which could be useful, and put them in touch with, again, or suggest ways in which they can reach out to people and resolve the situation. May not be an approach that most journalists take, and might be seen. To me, I believe that anything else is extractive if you don't share what you know.
Awesome. Thanks for that response. So we have a few more from Ritika, Zenya, Hemavathi, and was there one more? Namita?
Right.
Yeah.
Can we decode climate change and its effect without simplification? I think the simplification here is to essentially make it easy to read, not to be able to reduce its um, complexity. That which is to, again, capture life, um, capture. Of course, there will be stories where you're just doing the policy responses. There will be stories, or there will be things where you're just whatever doing the numbers and other things, and it's a quick thing, you need to get it out there, whatever. But with everything, just to try and foreground communities, to foreground stories, tell a compelling story, um, connect the characters, connect the ecosystems, connect, again, where is the country on a scale of privilege or in terms of emissions, and what are those challenges that are faced. And you can uh, do it in humanized parts of the globe which otherwise people won't care about, or issues. And a lot of this is through human storytelling. Like I have my one of my uncles partially lost his vision, and at one point he said, why don't you read out some of your award-winning pieces to me? And while I was like, yeah, awards in quotes. But so I read out some of, while I was reading my piece, I was like, no, this is boring, that is boring, no, I don't want to read this section out. And realizing that a lot of course, reporting is essential, being completely factual is essential, but we also want people to read a story to identify and feel things. And that's often, yeah, and you can do that while doing strong, powerful investigative journalism. You can do that through art installations on air pollution that connect points. There are different ways of telling the story, which don't necessarily have to exclude the facts.
Agreed.
And okay, all right. Second question, I think. Okay. International organizations which are supposed to support the field are doing enough. Um, they're doing what they do, which is, I think, in every part of. So at least what I try to see it is a sort of chain of throwing spanners at a system that's determined to crush us. So I think everyone has their role or a part to play. That may sound like a disturbing industrial metaphor, but everyone has a different role to play. I think one is, of course, international organizations are good at what they do in terms of having the media access to scream from, or the megaphones to put that message out, to have enough money to do media, to do campaign work. That's the kind of stuff that international organizations of one kind or NGOs can do. Others are aid organizations, or if you were to see the UNFCCC, well, or UN itself, I mean, a lot can be desired there. But I think if we are to look at it in the scale of things, you have from your local freedom of information or right to information activist, or to a fishing community that's there trying to you safeguard, a port from being built on their waters. I think looking at that, two lawyers, two regional networks, two national networks, everyone plays a different role. So you'll have your lawyers in Delhi, you'll have your activists on ground, you have somebody who does the translating in between, you have an international organization that picks up their story and tries to get it attention. Every bit of it counts, whether it's the mom who decides to mobilize other moms against pollution and saying that, okay, I actually support the climate strikes, um, or I will file litigation, to people who are putting their bodies on the line. So I would not. And again, here's the other thing is that we have gotten used to outsourcing responsibility. And that's sort of what individualism and capitalism does to you, where you're like, it's somebody else's business. And for it to come from people who are otherwise educated and privileged to say that is, and who don't have to deal with the actual, if you're sitting and working from home, then you know that that we are in a spot of privilege, right? So yeah, I think that the outsourcing of responsibility has to end, and engaging with the environment or connecting with others who are already working is essential. So instead of necessarily only relying, again, like most of the movements that I've been privileged to observe and be a part of, organizations will come and go. They'll be like, this is my campaign for now. Next cycle, it's something else. But movements stay, and which is why, again, formulating some of that and doing that in your own communities makes a tremendous amount of difference. So yeah, let's not outsource our responsibility only to NGOs, and especially take away from what the state should be doing and the role that we have in forming what that is and who we vote for, or the sort of systems that we built locally, that where we have stronger governments or we are involved in it. Not going to see this problem solved in our lifetimes. I don't know. I mean, solved is a weird word, but we can see hope. Yeah. Right. Okay. And looking for any other questions.
Hemavathi, you said you had one, but you didn't type it in. Do you want to just share it in?
Yeah.
Unmute yourself.
Yes. Thanks, Lainey. Okay. I hope you can understand what I'm saying. So I just want to get into the concept of climate justice in India. And, recently I saw this report of the Ministry of Environment putting out saying India is one of the top performers in terms of climate change. And I had a huge laugh at that, especially considering how we are looking at climate change and the role of media. My question to you is in terms of the role of media and reporting, in terms of perspective, right? So India, otherwise, like just justify our actions behind this wheel of lesser per capita emissions, although we are like the third most greenhouse gas emitting country. And just like for another example, in terms of climate justice, we lead the International Solar Alliance, but setting up a solar park right to villages that are drought prone, where solar parks need water, but then this is like you're supporting solar parks at the cost of denying right to water to the communities living right next to the solar park. So just in terms of reporting all these things in perspective, like people could applaud the establishment of the solar park, but not everybody knows that this is happening at the cost of a community's right to water. So how do you think these challenges of giving a perspective in terms of climate justice becomes important by the media?
You're speaking right to my heart. And I think you should sign up for some journalism job or for a grant, because I think those are extremely compelling stories. I've alienated and, of course, some people and but at the same time, we have respect for each other's opinions and otherwise, especially on this. And I do recognize that it is a problematic position, but to me, that's one thing that stands out is that we cannot keep hiding behind the poor and the idea of per capita emissions absolving us of responsibility in the present. Now, as much as we might be like we have a right to our carbon space, well, so do many other nations who don't have the same geopolitical or economic swag in the region as we do. And the poor that we are hiding behind are the ones who are facing the worst impacts right now. Looking at the number of farmer suicides, looking at drought conditions, the Bihar floods, each of these are staring at us in the face. Now, it's very difficult for me to sit with the feeling that, okay, yes, technically, historically, we are the good guys, but it is an important position. And it is that duality which still sits uncomfortably, but it is also a factor that yes, the ambition should be led by those who've had historically greater footprint, but at the same time, I'm not buying it. It's not your get out of jail free card to step up. Or again, like whose solar park is it? Why does that company have a monopoly both over coal and contracts and over producing solar? I think it's extremely important for us to ask those questions, and it often irritates me that essentially it's prior to this that a lot of the stories about India would immediately be about solar. Look, this much capacity added. Look, these are the extremely low prices, right? Without saying a thing about coal, it almost became a thing like anybody who's not Trump is a climate leader. And that's incredibly, that is American exceptionalism in the media, which is okay. We're going to look for stories of hope from everybody else because we think our despot is the worst. Or in terms of again our climate, our refusal to be in the Paris Agreement is the worst thing that can happen. So I think that's something that needs to be zeroed in on, especially like I think the policies and why solar was not able to thrive is again the kind of import duties which were imposed. So we were only looking in terms of how much capacity. Okay, we signed this agreement, that MOU, that how many projects have actually gone off the ground, where are they being implemented? So those are questions that need to be asked. I mean, but also we are from let's just also acknowledge of where we are in terms of the Indian media being able to run stories on fabricated stories around like, well, everything from an actor's suicide being a massive plot to human rights activists being implicated in plot to assassinate the prime minister and spark of riots, which are again, these were some of the activists who were doing some of the mobilizing work on ground in these rural, coal-rich, mineral-rich areas, suddenly being implicated on this plot via a right-wing television network. So if that place has shrunk so much, I think we need to be asking ourselves, like, what is the kind of media that we want, and how are we willing to push that, make that happen? Or now that that has, since fossil fuel magnates own large television and media networks, and they refuse to run this sort of coverage, who is going to? It puts more again emphasis and focus on foreign correspondents, on international media to be able to pick up on these stories, and there's only like a fraction of it. Like, okay, how does it fit into how our American audience will read this? So again, it becomes, so the place for complexity also reduces. So it is unfortunately a sort of cycle, but I think with digital media, with more grants, and I think that's a space that really needs to kind of grow, which is support for journalists, support for those working at regional local bureaus, or for those willing to tell these stories, in places that are being impacted right now, and who are dealing with where freedom of press and truth is under attack, that's something that really needs to grow. So all of the right questions, please report.
Yeah, awesome. Great question, Hemavati. And I think with that, we can maybe wrap up for today. Let's see if I'm missing anything. Yeah, just a lot of positive comments. Yeah, this was a really wonderful session, and I really appreciate hearing from you today. And yeah, I'm excited to share the recording and continue the dialogue from here. I'm hoping that more and more of us can share our climate storytelling, our written assignments for this course, our personal reflections and experiences. And it's been a great forum to just talk about this right now today. So I'll return to this often, I feel like, for my own writing motivations.
Yeah, just wanted to also quickly just add, I know this is a bit late in the day, but not all stories have to be climate stories. Some stories can be environmental stories. Some stories can be about environmental justice. And you don't necessarily, I think we also need to and these are stories that need to be told as well. So I think phrasing it and not having to work a climate angle into everything is also just as important, as we should be building all of the connections that climate enables us to do so. But you've been such a wonderful audience and a great class to chat with and to also to engage with. And it's just brought so much to the discussion. And I hope this was useful, and hope to hear from and see a lot more of your writing work and other stuff emerge from now.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you for that final point. That was really well taken. And I will share all of this, the chat and the recording and everything, and I'll share the recording with you as well, Aruna. And I look forward to staying connected as we move forward with our Terra experiences.
Thank you so much. See everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.